It was this union of sentiment, of instinct, and of will which created the power of the emperor. It is a grave error to think that a great man is omnipotent and that he derives his powers only from himself. To know how to divine, to use wisely, and to guide, these are the first qualities of a superior genius. I have taken care, said Napoleon, not to fall into the error of the men of modern systems, to imagine that I represent of myself, and through my own thoughts, the wisdom of nations. The skill of the workman consists in knowing how to avail himself of the materials which he has at hand. One of the first necessities of a government is to understand well the state of the country which it rules, and to know where exists the elements of strength upon which it can rely. The ancient monarchy had for supports the nobility and the clergy because at that time, the two principal elements of strength resided in those two classes, which represented landed wealth and moral influence. The revolution had destroyed all that feudal edifice. It had displaced interests, created new sources of power and wealth, and given birth to new ideas. To attempt to restore the ancient regime to rely upon forces which no longer had roots would have been folly. The emperor, while reestablishing ancient forms and founding his authority, relied only upon the young and vigorous sap of new interests. He reestablished the clergy, but without making them a means of government. So also the transition from the republic to a monarchy and the reestablishment of public worship, instead of awakening fears, reassured men's minds. For far from costing any interest, these acts satisfied political and moral wants and responded to the wishes of the majority. Indeed, if these transformations had not corresponded with the sentiments and ideas of the majority, Napoleon would not have made them, for he appreciated correctly and he desired to augment, not to weaken, his moral power. Thus, never before were so great changes accomplished with so little effort. Napoleon had but to say, "Let the churches be open," and the faithful rushed to fill them. He asked the nation, "Do you wish the governing power to be hereditary?" And the nation answered affirmatively by 4 million votes. It is difficult to disengage ourselves entirely from the past. Generations, like individuals, are controlled by their antecedents. Our sentiments are, for the most part, only traditions. Slave of the recollections of his infancy, man obeys all his life without suspecting it. The impressions which he received in his early days and the trials of influences to which he was then subjected. The life of a people is subject to the same general laws. A single day cannot change a republic of 500 years into a hereditary monarchy, or convert a monarchy of 1400 years into an elective republic. Consider Rome. During 500 years, her republican form existed, and they placed her at the head of the world. During 500 years, the elective system produced great men, and the dignity of consul, a senator, of tribune was far above that of the thrones of kings, whom the Romans knew only by seeing them chained to the triumphal cars of their conquerors. And although Rome could no longer maintain those institutions which had endured for ages and which had created her grandeur and her power, she preserved nevertheless for 600 years more, under the emperors, the venerated forms of the republic. So the French Republic, which succeeded a monarchy of 1400 years, under which France had become great and glorious in virtue of the sole principle of monarchical centralization, in spite of the faults and errors of her kings. So the French Republic not only soon reclothed itself with the ancient forms, but from its very origin it preserved the distinctive character of the monarchy by proclaiming and strengthening by every means that centralization of power which had been the vital element of French nationality. Let us add to these considerations that Napoleon and Caesar, who found themselves in analogous circumstances, had to act with the same motives in opposite ways. Both of them wished to reconstruct with ancient forms upon new principles. It belonged to Caesar, therefore, to preserve republican forms, to Napoleon to reestablish the forms of monarchy. At the commencement of the 19th century, great unanimity was felt in favor of rendering the power of the emperor hereditary, whether because of the traditional force of ancient institutions or of the prestige which surrounds men invested with authority, or of the desire for an order of things, which could give greater guarantees of stability. But the difficulty of establishing the republican form might perhaps be explained by another consideration. France since 1789 had been democratic, but it is difficult to conceive in a great European state the existence of a republic without an aristocracy. There are in every country two sorts of interests, very distinct and often opposed to each other. General interests and particular interests, or in other words, permanent interests and transcending generations. Their spirit transmits itself from age to age by tradition rather than by calculation. These interests can be represented only by an aristocracy, or in the absence thereof, by a hereditary family. A particular and transient interests, on the contrary, change continually according to circumstances and can be well understood only by representatives of the people, who, being renewed continually, present a faithful expression of the wants and the wishes of the masses. Now, France having no longer an aristocracy and being no longer able to maintain an aristocracy, that is to say, a privileged body whose influence is great only because its authority is consecrated by time, the republic would have been destitute of this conservative power, which, though often oppressive, yet a faithful guardian of general and permanent interests, built up during a series of centuries at Rome, Venice, and London the greatness of the respective nations by simple perseverance in a national system.